Welcome to ABA On Call. Join myself, Rick Kubina. This is the maturing of our science that can be done, and Doug Kostewicz.
It is so powerful to be able to convey numbers rather than the subjective nature of words.
For thought-provoking conversation. Hey everybody, would you like to get a CEU for this episode? Listen closely for the announcement of 3 secret words delivered throughout the episode. Take note of those words and we will tell you where to go to get your CEU when the show is over. Hello everyone, welcome back to ABA On Call, and today we have the concluding discussion for our mega series, which is how do you 10x clinical outcomes. Doug, we've been talking about how you do this with measurement, because in behavior analysis, it's all about the measurement.
Right. And it's all about the decisions we make from the data we display.
That's totally it. The reason why we take such good measures, the reason why we want to take such good measures is so then we can make decisions. That's it. We're talking about the applied world here. If you were doing pure research, it might be a little bit different. You wouldn't necessarily be making a decision. You're just trying to find something out about the way the universe and nature works. So you might not be making a decision. But in the past, we've talked about 2 things. We've talked about how can you quantify and use trend, celeration, as we call it in precision teaching, to help 10x your outcomes? How would you use level again, what is it? How do you measure it? How does that 10x outcomes? And of course, the third pillar in single case design is variability. That's what we're told to look at, variability. And how can this be something that you can examine and incorporate it into your daily practice to help 10x things? And I'm just going to put a slide up here, and you probably recall this, you Doug and you audience members. If you went through an undergrad or a grad course and you talked about, and you had a statistics class, people are going to discuss variability. And there's different ways that you can describe variability statistically. We're not going to get into all of those, but just something you probably remember is the old bell curve. And you may remember the standard deviation. And that standard deviation is a technical term that's talking about how your data are clustered around the mean. And again, the mean, you probably remember what that is. So you can have this normal bell curve as is shown on the right, or you can have these highly distributed bell curves. But when we talk about, in single case, when we talk about variability, Doug, we're talking about something very different here.
Right.
And maybe you could briefly describe, well, what does variability look like? What do we mean when we talk about variability in single case design?
So one of the prime drivers you mentioned earlier was trend. And that is the direction of your data within a condition. So if you're thinking about variability, very basically, it's how that data is, as you use here, dispersed around, above, and below that trend line. So the idea here is that you're just, you take that line, however you use it, if it's visual, line of least regression, etc., and you're looking there. So the line that's in the slide here, you'll see that data are above and below that line. And the extent to which that is going on is the amount of variability that your data show within that condition.
Yeah, that's it. We are interested in, like, if you were doing stats and you're like, how tall are the 12th graders in my local high school? Someone gets all of those measures, and if you were looking for variability, then you have this bell curve. But that's not how we do our business. We're interested in an individual, and we're interested in applying an intervention to that individual. And we want to know, what happens day to day. If that dispersal is very high, we say we have high variability. But if that dispersal is very tight, then we say we have stability. And in these slides that I'm sharing, for any of you who are just listening, if you check this out, go to our notes pages, or if you check out the YouTube, you'll notice that we use the term bounce lines. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the next segment, but that's a precision teaching term. And what we do is we take a line and we just put it, how does it go above the topmost and the bottommost? And when we do this, what we can also do now with variability is we can look at what we call, we'll call this up variability, or in the precision teaching language, we have up bounce. In this picture that I'm showing, as Doug, as you were saying earlier, you have a line that bisects the data, and it's going up, it's going down, it's flat, whichever way the trend is. And these two lines that you put above and below the data, if they're done equidistantly, and many times it does show up like that, but sometimes it doesn't. But just for the sake of this showing you, if you have the shaded in area and your trend's going up, and you have all of these dots that are above that trend line, the reason why we call this up bounce is because this tells you on a good day, how is the variability going to be higher than it is typically. And then opposite to that, if you shade in the lower section below the trend line, you would call that down bounce or down variability. And this is going to tell you, well, what's going to happen on a bad day. And then if you look at the entire range between those two lines that are above your trend line, we're just going to call that total bounce. So right away, we now have this incredible ability to give us this information. And although we're going to talk about how do you quantify this, how do you use this, I got to tell you, Doug, very few people that I know and that I see actually do anything with variability. I mean, we're talking about some very nuanced way of looking at variability, but I hardly see anybody talk about variability, period.
Well, I think there's two things. One, I want to follow up on something you said here. So the assumption that Rick's talking about is that we want to improve this behavior. So you're seeing this trend going up. Now, if that trend was instead going down, that's where we'd want that behavior. So if we're looking at something to decrease, so if you're seeing a down bounce, it's still meaning the same thing. It's above and below the lines, but it's the idea is it doesn't matter where that line is going up and down, it's around the line. But to get to your other point, why is this so important? Why should they pay attention? What does that mean, Rick? What does that variability mean? If you lay some kind of trend line down, it means you have control.
Amen.
And if you don't have lots of variability, right, up or down, then that means that there are a lot of other factors at play that you've either not looked at, not understood, not measuring, that are influencing and decreasing potentially the value of the intervention you have in play. And as we will talk about, decreasing that variability gives you a much better understanding of the intervention at play and the effect on that individual, whether it's to benefit them or we could do something better because it's actually other effects that are helping them, not the intervention at play. So
yeah,
that is the why we don't see it more. I don't know, because you make a great statement. This is just, this had high variability, this had low variability. That should be as integral as the direction of the behavior, as also the level of the behavior. And that's why it's one of the big three.
Yeah. In fact, I mean, I wish this was like a child show and I had some animation where it go ding, ding, ding when you said the magic word. When you said control, and If you don't like the word control, then use the word influence. All of science is about understanding variability or control and influence. You can think about any other science. Gravity controls mass. That's it. How much, if you look at my mass on planet Earth and you look at my mass on the moon or Saturn, it's going to change because we understand the science behind it. We have this variable that's exerting influence or control over this other variable called mass. This is what we do in behavior analysis. And Doug, you just said it. If we're not paying attention to this, what the hell? This is so important for us when we work with clients, with people, with anyone that we're doing single case design with. It is one of the big three. Everyone always talks about it because it will reflect these variables that we are in any way when we implement the intervention. How is that variability? How's that variable affecting the person? And it's going to show up in our variability.
Yeah. I mean, there's not too much more to say at the general level. The more or the higher that envelope, the less you can almost say about your intervention. The tighter that envelope, even more you can say about that intervention. So I think that's a really strong lead-in for what we're going to next. But I wanted to give our first secret word before we go into section 2. And that is count. So this brings us into the second part. And now let's figure out ways to quantify variability. So we were left earlier with high or low. But as you may see, Rick, one of the themes across these 3 mega series is quantification. And there is ways to quantify bounce, especially on a ratio chart, as you see. So using your envelope, so for those of you listening, you can see in the show notes again and then the slides, we've redrawn the envelope. And what you see is it's a line. So the envelope runs from the 1 to 5. So this, using a ratio chart, this bounces at times 5, which suggests that your data are within a total around above and below a total of times 5. Now, if you quantify at times 5, you can now begin to compare, and from condition to condition, you can compare intervention to intervention. You now have numbers rather than words.
Yeah. Let me dig in and just explain this number a little bit, because it's hard to understand when you can quantify variance or you can do that on a linear graph in a linear world, but it's so much better on a ratio graph. And we just don't have the time to get into the really mathematical nuance. And there's something called homogeneity of variance, and it is violated when you use a linear graph. It is not when you use a ratio graph. So if any of you are really interested in nerding out on this, read more on homogeneity of variance, but we don't have the time to get into it. And it just really is for people to understand what this looks like on a ratio graph. That number that Doug was describing at times 5. So in the picture that we showed, we have this, the data are trending upward. And you have the line that bisects the data, and then you have an upper line that is a trend that's running parallel to that trend line, and then you have a lower line. And in both of those lines, they are capturing the uppermost and the bottommost and all the things in between. So if we measure that as a times 5, what that means is, let's say one day your data is at 1. If your data is times 5, that means On that day, your data could be anywhere from 1 to 1 times 5. So that would be anywhere from 1 to 5. But what if a month later, your data were at 5? Then what that means is on that day, if you have times 5, your data could be anywhere from 5 as the bottom to 5 times 5, which would be 25. And this is something that if you can wrap your head around it, you can understand the power of bounce. Because now, Doug, what is so amazing about this, I'm going to quiz you here. If you have a data point that is, like I said, from the very beginning, if it starts at 1 and it's times 5 and it goes from, it could be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What if you have a data point that's at 10? What do we call that? It's not within the bounce envelope.
Oh, okay. So that's considered an outlier.
Yes. This
So
is how.
Yeah.
Go with it. Tell us
I was
why
just going to say,
important.
so it's an outlier. So it's outside of the bounce envelope. Something really big happened. We don't know, but that prompts you as the practitioner, as the behavior analyst, you need to go find out. You may not be able to, but you need to go find out and ask a lot more questions about the data that happened on that day. It could have been somebody took the data incorrectly. There could have been my favorite person was there sitting next to me, working with me. You never know until you ask, but that is a cue for you to go and ask and to go and find out more.
Yeah, based off of what you just said, I think we need a whole show on outliers.
Okay.
But that is what you said is exactly right. But again, another thing that I'm excited about, how do you know if you're looking at an article that's in Java, whatever your favorite behavior analyst, how do you know if it's an outlier when you look at those linear graphs that are most likely the x-axis is going to be sessions? How do you know unless it's so freaking extreme that you're like, oh yeah, that's an outlier.
Wait a minute.
Really know?
You're giving a lot of credit there because so freaking extreme, if you've changed the axes variables, it may not really be that extreme. It may look extreme, but it may not be extreme. But that sounds like an argument that we've had before and we'll have again.
Yeah. It's hard not to start going down these other rabbit holes. So let's get back to this number. Having understanding the bounce number or the variability number. In precision teaching, we call it bounce. And the reason why we call it bounce is because the behavior is bouncing around from day to day. That's just why. But variability works too. All of a sudden, this number is going to tell you things. This number, as I was mentioning earlier, no matter where you are in time, this number, if it's times 2, times 5, times 10, times 50, what that's doing is it's painting a picture for exactly how much variability is. And this is something that as a field, we haven't made use of, but we could make use of. And if you think about all of the studies that are being done, what if people started quantifying all their variability? Then we'd have lots of information for what kind of control do you have for this particular intervention or that particular intervention. And these numbers mean something to the practitioner. I mean, we're going to talk about this more in a bit, but right now, explaining this number, this is part of the utility of it.
Right. I'm ready to give you the second word, and that word is,
let's hear it.
Bounce.
There we go. We have a second secret word, and that means we're ready to start chatting about the last section. And now that we explain briefly what that number means, and I guess I would point this out too, Doug, if people want to get more about, I mean, our podcast, we're here to hopefully provide information, but also ignite people's interest in some
Right.
things that they might not be aware of. So if any of you are interested in this, and we'll put some sources, some precision teaching sources that you can download, and other places you can go to read more about this, because it's worth your time. The last section that we talk about is, okay, now that you know what this is, how do you use this to 10x your clinical outcomes? And I'm going to throw some data up here. And Doug, this is exactly what you were talking about. If we take a data set, and this is all about showing influencer control. So this explains what you were using your words to paint our picture with. So this is actually getting at what you were saying. If we look at an envelope and we understand that there are data points that are going on throughout the time, we now have, if you have high variability, then that's going to mean some things. So in terms of your clinical understanding, Doug, what would high variability signal? What could that mean here?
Well, I mean, you've written the three things down here that I would come to mind. So one, you don't have a lot of control. So the intervention itself isn't providing the control. One or two, there are confounding sources of control, things that you've not considered or you thought that weren't going to affect the behavior, and they are in turn affecting the behavior. In this case, a behavior identified for deceleration, decrease, and or you are not implementing a very good intervention properly, and so you are getting poor treatment integrity. So there's those, and just because they could be all three of them. So these sources should prompt you to try to rule these things out. So high variability, that should be a signal to you to immediately do something, not make a decision about stopping an intervention, not make a decision about changing. It's making a decision about really going over what's going on now. Because hopefully you made the best possible choice regarding that intervention to begin with. So there was a reason why you chose it. Now make sure evaluate all these other factors before just tossing it in the garbage.
Yeah, very well said. Now, whether you are a researcher, you and I have our researcher's hat on often when we conduct our own research, when we work with our students, or you're a practitioner and you read the literature or you have an idea on how to affect change, we don't know what the heck's going to happen. Like, you could, I remember when I was doing my student teaching so many years ago, I had this teacher who was like a co-teaching experience, but in student teaching, it really means I was the main teacher and this person was giving me advice. That was co-teaching back then. And we were working with students with learning disabilities, and he said, you know what I read? I read that if you use different color chalk, that will really activate these brain pathways and these kids will really understand stuff. So he gave me all this different chalk, and this guy was using different color chalk. And you know what happened when I used different color chalk with these students, Doug?
Let me guess. You got different stains on your hand.
Exactly.
Oh, okay.
Absolutely nothing. So this intervention had no control whatsoever. So if I were, even though someone wrote about this and this showed up in the literature, that someone's like, oh, I did some study in chalk, did whatever, it had no effect on any one of my students. So the detective work that you can do just based on variability is just such a powerful thing. And if you're not if you're not using a ratio graph, and you're not looking at variability, you are completely missing out. So when we talk about 10xing the things that you could do as a clinician for producing better outcomes, like, wow, if each one of these things that you describe could be at play, maybe one of them, two of them, all of them, you need to figure that out, because otherwise you just don't know. And if you don't know things, then what's a teacher doing? What's a behavior analyst doing? You want to understand what effects variables have on the people you're working with, and the variability is going to tell you.
Well, I think even one step further, you don't need to be doing some major intervention to begin plotting data, right? You can, let's just say you're doing what you normally would do in a classroom or clinical setting, and you could just start putting some different data down and looking at this, and you could start to see measuring variability. Is the things that we're doing normally, not just some specialized intervention, is it producing high bounds? And if it is, you can begin to look at just what's going on in the world around you, rather than thinking about this as I'm taking it a step further. Obviously, if you're going to use some specialized intervention and you need to respond to that data, but we do a lot of educational techniques. We do a lot of things working with people. Bounce can tell you a lot about what's going on. And quantifying it can really help you make just more decisions that are benefiting the people you're working with, even not specifically, like not a specific intervention. This is just thinking about how to do better what we do. Wow, that was very poorly worded, but that's okay.
We get what you mean.
Right.
You're absolutely right. I mean, if what you're saying is that, I'm going to take the baton you're passing to me. If, we live in a world where people in education always say, hey, everybody is different. And this is true. Everybody is different. But even though everybody's different, we figured out things that work for many, many people. And it's like medical science. If you have strep throat, we learn that if people are going to give you some form of penicillin, let's say that works for 80% of the people. But there's this other 20% it doesn't work for. Fine. That means that 8 out of 10 people, I can fix their issue with this intervention. And it's the same thing for us. Yes, every person's going to respond differently. We all have our own idiosyncratic reinforcers. But if we start using bounce and quantifying it, we would see what is the range of control, and we could quantify it. It's not just visually looking at it, because if you live in the world that we have set up right now, Doug, is everybody make up your own graph. Everybody use your own subjective opinion and decide what's high variability, what's low variability. Then that means our understanding of variability across all of these interventions reside with each person's individual opinion. How can you make a science of that? I mean, yes, I appreciate other people in the field, but I'm not going to appreciate other people's opinions necessarily. I want numbers. I want objectivity. And if you are quantifying variability, then that number is a direct reflection over how is this particular variable that you set up in this situation affecting a person. And Doug, that right there is some science that I want everyone to be able to access, because if you do it, it's going to drive more positive outcomes.
So what's even more frustrating, just to add on to this, is we have the data. People are doing a great job collecting all of these numbers. They're taking objective measures of behavior. You're not asking for people to take data. You're not asking for us to measure things. You're simply asking, when you drop a dot or an X or a number onto that tool, what is a better way to look at it? Now, I wanted to take your frustration, add a little bit. While we strive for basically ×1 variability, that means that you have a straight line that shows no deviation from the trend. We have so much individuality with how we interact with the environment that you're rarely, if ever, going to approach a ×1 variability. But we wouldn't know that if we weren't measuring variability. So while you may see a ×3, a ×4, that may not actually be that bad. But we won't know that until everyone starts to interact with variability in an objective measure. So that, just as we talked before, if an intervention produced a certain level relatively, if objectively, if they produced a certain celeration, now we can start to see if interventions produce certain range of variabilities, and it can allow you also to make better choices regarding the interventions we use, what works for the individuals that we're trying to help, and what behaviors we're targeting. So this is an additional measure that can improve not only our decision making regarding the data we're seeing, but influences our decision making when we evaluate interventions prior to intervening, so that we don't have a delay in services.
Yeah. That was so profound. I'm going to give the next secret word, because there's no topping that. And that is always. So we have our 3 secret words. And Doug, this brings us to the end. And this also, I'd like to make a comment before we wrap up and see what you have to think. This was a fun series.
Yep.
And, we talked about 3 ways. We talked about trend, we talked about level, we talked about variability. All of our textbooks say you need to do this. And we've shown people how each one of those can be quantified, how each one of those can be standardized, and how each one of those, if you add them in, you're 10xing your ability to create outcomes. So I have really enjoyed talking to you about these topics, and I hope that our listeners have also taken something away and have found that this could be something that they could incorporate in their practice.
Most definitely. And I hope that we can think of another series that is as profound and exciting as this one, because this was a lot of fun.
So thank you, listeners, for joining us. Thank you, all of you who have been hitting those likes in your podcast feed. That really helps the algorithm for us to get our word out there. So thank you all for your likes, and thank you all for sharing this podcast with others. So on behalf of Doug and myself, we thank you for joining us on ABA On Call.
Thanks for watching this episode of ABA On Call. To get your CEU, follow the link and instructions below the video. You can enjoy the program again there, or you can go straight to the attendance verification quiz. Just enter the secret words and pay the CEU fee to generate your certificate.